Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with introductions, and let's get started on our session. My name is Joyce Peng. I'm a third-year surgery resident at the University of New Mexico. I am so pleased to have all of you joining us today for this very, very important panel on addressing anti-Asian racism. And I am so excited to have this group of amazing panelists. I want to start off by introducing our moderators. We have Dr. Sirisha Kapula, who's our Chief Medical Officer for Ambulatory at UNM and is a nephrologist by training. She is also one of our co-chairs for our Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Tae Nam is one of our fourth-year medical students. He identifies as Korean American and will be representing our Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association chapter at UNM as moderator. As for our distinguished panelists, we have Dr. Jeung, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and author of books and articles on race and religion. He's written Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, Mountain Movers, At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. In March 2020, Dr. Jeung co-founded StopAPI Hate with Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. It tracks incidents of COVID-19 discrimination to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. Our second panelist, Dr. Shin, is an assistant professor of history and American culture at the University of Michigan, where he is also a core faculty member in the program in Asian and Pacific Islander American Studies. Ian's teaching and research focus on the history of U.S. foreign relations and Asian American studies. In addition to completing his first book on cultural relations between the U.S. and China in the early 20th century, Ian has published articles and reviews in the Journal of American East Asian Relations, Journal of Asian American Studies, The Public Historian, and Connecticut Historical Review. He has also contributed commentary to NBC, BBC, Los Angeles Times, the History Channel, and other media outlets, and has presented on Asian American issues to leading organizations in the consulting, financial services, and travel industries. Ian received his PhD from Columbia University and currently lives in Ann Arbor with his husband. Our third panelist is familiar to UNM. Dr. Myra Washington is the Assistant Vice President for Faculty Equity and Diversity and Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Utah. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, identity, and culture. In her book, Blasian Invasion, Racial Mixing in the Celebrity Industrial Complex, she examines mixed race Black and Asian people as a way to critique current understandings of race in the US, especially through highlighting how communities of color act in solidarity with each other. I am so thrilled to have all three of you here. And so we'll go ahead and get started with some questions. And to start us off, can you comment on the increasing visibility and incidence of anti-Asian racism during the last year? And I'll ask Dr. Jeung to start us off.
Well, thanks, Joyce. Thanks, University of New Mexico Health Science for inviting us. I'm glad to be part of this distinguished panel and excited about the conversation. You asked about the rise and surge of anti-Asian racism over the last year. And I think the increased visibility came about because there's so much racism. It's so widespread. The Pew Research Center says 45% of Asian Americans experienced racism directly last year. When you talk to students and young people, 90 to 95%, so they experience vicarious racism by seeing it online, racist post-offensive memes. So I'll quickly share with you what we've received at StopAPI Hate. This is a reporting center where Asian Americans self-report what's happening. And through the end of March, we received 6,600 incidents from across the nation. And they're just traumatizing. When you read our incidents, they're just horrific. And so I wasn't surprised to see elderly killed this year. I wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shooting, sadly, because the hate, again, is so widespread. And when you hear about the incidents, how people have so much anger and fear directed towards Asians, it's just palpable. You can see here, there's 4 types of racism. They're not all hate crimes. We face civil rights violations, such as mistreatment at the workplace, being denied ride shares. Online harassment is really prevalent. Again, it may not be direct racism, but I think young people really see on their screens a lot of vicarious racism. Microaggressions make up the bulk of our incidents, but 1 out of 5 of our respondents now show signs of racial trauma. So even if it's not a physical assault, this is a health issue because our people are experiencing elevated symptoms of anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, and avoidance. So I'm actually arguing this is a collective experience of racial trauma. It's akin to Japanese American incarceration in terms of how widespread it is, how traumatizing it is, how it will have long-term impacts. This has really, really galvanized and impacted the community. Finally, physical assault makes up the final category. We're getting coughed and spat upon. I think it's a reaction to COVID-19. People see us as public health threats, and so they want to, reinfect us. I don't really get this behavior. And we're getting pushed and shoved, having bottles and rocks thrown at us. People try to run us over with our cars. There's been 6 to 7 incidents where Lysol has been sprayed on Asian Americans. So it's not only that we're carrying the disease, but we are the infection itself. We are what's defiling or making unhealthy America. The trends have been consistent. Women have been attacked twice as much as men, elderly and young people are disproportionately impacted. And it is a case of racial profiling. 60% of our incidents are not Chinese. So people who look Chinese, Vietnamese, Japanese, Koreans are also being attacked. A Latino in LA was punched and told to go back to China. An indigenous person in Vancouver was attacked and told to go back to China. So again, I can't underscore how widespread and how violent and traumatizing it is. I'm really concerned about our elderly who are self-isolating now. And so as a result, we are getting the visibility. This is not an Asian American issue, but a national issue of violence and racism. And that's why we're getting the visibility we deserve. Thanks.
Dr. Shin, as a student of history and professor of history, what are some examples of racism towards individuals and communities of Asian identities historically and currently? And also what history has led to this?
Thank you, Dr. Pang. And I want to say again, as Dr. Jeung said at first too, thank you for having this conversation, especially thank you for having this conversation actually outside of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, because it's important to continue this conversation outside of that specific month, which was wonderful to celebrate and to remember the struggles and the achievements of the AAPI community. But that conversation needs to continue because these issues will continue. But to Dr. Pang's question about the history behind this, Dr. Jeung alluded a little already to some of the historical instances of racism against people of Asian descent in the United States, most notably the Japanese American internment during World War II. I think one of the things that people have said in reacting to these incidents is, well, that's, this kind of violence or this kind of racism is so un-American. And one of the things that, as a historian, I think I and other scholars of Asian American history try to emphasize, and I think folks who study the history of people of color in this country and indigenous people as well will understand, is that this history is in fact this violence is very American. And one of the things that we know, for example, when we look at the history of violence against APIs, is that it has taken both extra-legal, right, non-state sanctioned forms, but also state sanctioned or legal forms of violence and racism. So when it comes to the kinds of violent acts that Dr. Jeung was describing, for example, we see a long history of that, reaching all the way back to the mid-1800s. So, for example, between 1850 and roughly 1900, there were almost 200 towns across the American West, from California stretching all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, where Chinese were driven out of those places. Their belongings kind of burned and thrown out. They were kind of marched out of town. The most kind of famous of these incidents happened in LA in 1871, when 19 Chinese people, which was 10% of the Chinese population in Los Angeles, were killed in 1885 in Rock Springs, Wyoming. 28 Chinese minors were killed by a mob and 15 more were injured. Similar kinds of incidents of violence happened also against Japanese, Korean, South Asian, and Filipino immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. And then, as Dr. Jeung mentioned, we had the Japanese American internment. And then more recently, just a few decades ago, some of you may be familiar with the case of Vincent Shin. As somebody who teaches and lives in southeastern Michigan, that's a case that's very close to my heart. In that particular case, a 27-year-old Chinese American man was beaten to death at a time of heightened competition between the Japanese and US economies, especially in the automotive manufacturing industry. He was blamed for the decline of the US auto manufacturing industry and was beaten to death a week before his wedding in Detroit, Michigan. And so, the cases of kind of misperceptions or perceptions of race that Dr. Jeung was talking about also have very violent histories that have very tragic consequences. I think I also want to cover quickly, it's not just about the extra-legal violence that has happened to Asian Americans, but that racism has also been institutionalized through legal forms, right? So, the US government beginning as early as 1875 started passing laws that excluded certain members of the Asian community, first with Chinese women and what were then called coolie laborers, and then all working people starting in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then successively up through 1924 when the door to immigration and naturalization was closed to people of all Asian backgrounds in the United States. And that was not really undone until 1965. And so in these kinds of ways, the US government and governments at various levels from local to state have also enacted forms of legal racism against people of Asian descent. The last thing I'll say to this is that when we think about all of these forms of historical racism, Asian Americans have always fought back. And that's important to realize that they have fought back with the means that were available to them. When they couldn't vote, for example, they would take the cases to courts. And some of our most important legal rights, civil rights that we have today, like equal protection under the law, like birthright citizenship, are rights that were established by cases that Asian, specifically Chinese immigrants, brought to the Supreme Court to litigate. And so I think when we think about why this history is important, one, it's important to realize this is something that has happened before many, many times. But it's also important to remind us that our community has found a way out of these acts of violence, both extra-legal and legal, and resisted the racism that we faced. I'll stop there.
Dr. Washington, any comments?
Sure. So I think part of what I had in the list of questions, right, is to talk about the continuities that we see connecting what has happened in the past to now. And, I think about how I am coming to you guys from Goshute, Paiute, and Ute land. And I think, when Russell just pointed out that there was an Indigenous person who the attackers had mistaken for Asian, it reminds us how interlinked violence is against all communities of color. And so I think that this rise in anti-Asian violence and hate, right, accompanies the rise in anti-Indigenous hate and also with anti-Blackness. And so all of these things work in concert with each other. I think Ian just laid a wonderful foundation to talk about how, this is part and parcel of American history, that this violence has been visited upon Asians and Asian Americans. And because I study media and I especially look at media narratives, I think about how these narratives of not just perilous Asians, but dangerous Asians, as disease-ridden Asians are making a comeback. And so we see that happening when people call, COVID-19 Kung flu, right? It's the same thing that folks were saying before, that Asians are carriers of disease. But also accompanying that are things like the model minority myth. So this resentment for the success of certain groups of Asians. And, knowing that our conversation today is going to be about this sort of pan-Asian lumping together of all of these disparate groups means that, people who might not even benefit from this sort of model minority status will also be attacked for it because they're lumped in with all of these groups who are seen as extra successful. And so, yeah, I see these sorts of narratives making a comeback, and they're always cyclical because we'll see them, die down because, as Ian pointed out, right, these communities have always fought back against this violence and against this oppression. And so, as this dies down, fingers crossed, much sooner rather than later, for sure, there will be some other thing in the future that will cause this to pop back up, but hopefully we'll be even more prepared next time and we can really head it off at the pass. So yeah.
I think maybe if I could add just one thing to what Dr. Washington said, one of the sort of, and this ties back to something that Dr. Jeung said earlier as well, is that, when we think about the case of the Atlanta shootings, right, that the media narratives, especially around gender, are something that we have to pay really close attention to, because it brings an extra level of attention and violence to especially, AAPI women. And that has something to do, I think, we think about history with the history of US imperialism in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, and the way that the US military constructed or allowed certain kinds of relations and sex work for the US military, which then get reimported and celebrated in popular culture. So again, all of these things are very complex, but they really are all tied together.
I think you both did a beautiful transition to my next question, which is to Dr. Washington, how have stereotypes about Asian Americans contributed to anti-Asian racism? I wanted to ask Dr. Jeung or anyone, for example, the model minority is a common myth. Are there any others that come to mind? And maybe if Dr. Shin can comment, were there any stereotypes that have been beneficial to Asian Americans?
Yeah, so I'll start. Ian just talked about the Atlanta shootings, and I grew up for part of my life in Korea, and then we moved to Atlanta, and my mom opened up a Korean spa. So when that happened, immediately I was like so nervous because, right, for the entire time that my mother has had that spa, there has been this assumption, this tainting, the amount of visits from police, that there was something sexual, something untoward, something criminal happening at the spa, right? But really, Korean spas are delightful. If you've not experienced it, I would recommend it. And I think that that's part of it, is the hypersexualization, especially of Asian and Asian American women. I think the sort of passiveness of Asian American men also accompanies that. So I think when we see these attacks, that's a lot of what powers that, is that people feel like, oh, these are the folks who won't fight back because this is what, we're fed through all of these narratives of Asians and Asian Americans. And I think probably the final stereotype is also that there isn't this sort of collective action and will, that, Asian Americans are so disparate as ethnic groups that we won't come together, right, in this support, that South Asians and Southeast Asians won't join with East Asians to fight against all of the rhetoric, all of the violence. And so that is one thing that I'm glad to see, all of these groups really coming together and joining forces. And I'll pass it off to Russell.
Yeah, like Myra said, there is the model minority stereotype that we're successful, that we're hardworking, that we're quiet and won't complain. But that status of being insiders to America, of being white adjacent, really is conditional. And Ian talked about that, right? In times of war, in times of economic downturn, and in times of pandemic, we're no longer real Americans. We're not insiders, but we're outsiders to be excluded, right? And that's the perpetual foreigner stereotype, that we're outsiders, we're dangerous, we're the yellow peril, the dusky peril to be excluded. And for me, that stereotype is really much more operative at the moment. People aren't excluding us from the nation or from neighborhoods because grandma's so smart. They're excluding us because they think grandma doesn't belong because she's an outsider. She doesn't speak English. She has an accent. She doesn't have the right religion. So in terms of flipping the narrative, for me, in terms of really getting at the roots of the racism against Asian Americans, we really have to undercut that perpetual foreigner stereotype. We really have to promote this notion that we belong, that white normativity doesn't necessarily have to be the cultural predominant way of being. And even if you are a foreigner, you should still be treated well. So that's the thing, right? America treats foreigners so badly that we build laws, we separate their families, we apparently cough and spit on them. And so we just both have to change our notion, our imagination of who belongs to America, and as well, how we treat those whom we deem as foreigners, because even foreigners deserve respect and dignity.
I think maybe I'll just add, because Taeyang, you were asking about, whether or not some of these stereotypes are ever beneficial. And this is a question that comes up a lot, especially when we're thinking about the model minority stereotype. People will say, well, isn't it good to be thought of as high achieving and educationally, sort of well-educated or professionally successful and having, good nuclear families? I think to me, the question would be beneficial for whom and at what cost? I think historically, we can understand why some Asian Americans would have made the choices to, at various points in time, to play up the model minority stereotype in order to gain an advantage within a racist society that had previously seen them as the opposite of that, right? As deviant, as dirty, as inassimilable. But that came with a cost, right? It came with a cost of putting down other communities of color, especially brown and Latino, Black and Latino communities, sometimes actively, but most often just by reaffirming kind of these dominant cultural prejudices about other people of color. But ultimately, too, I think it comes at a cost to Asian Americans, right, in terms of living fully above and beyond the stereotypes with which they were associated, even if it's the model minority stereotype, which some might call a positive stereotype. It's still a stereotype, right? And it limits people's abilities to live, with kind of their full authentic self in all the different ways where they may not actually fit that stereotype. So again, I think it's important to think about, when we think about the benefit, quote unquotes, of the model minority stereotype, who does it benefit and who doesn't it benefit? And there are lots of losers in that game.
Thank you so much. So my next question is, what were some experiences growing up that you felt were unique to being Asian American? This question is I'd love to hear from actually all the panelists, but it is towards Dr. Washington, but I would love to hear from all of you guys.
All right, happy to start. Growing up, because we grew up in Korea, my brothers and I, before we moved here. And so for us, there didn't seem to be really much that was unique because we're like, everyone else is like this. And so when we moved to the States, I do remember thinking that no one else had to have Korean lessons on Saturday mornings and or continue to do homework that their parents gave them, that their teachers did not give them throughout the week. And then I, met more folks. And I think that was a much more immigrant parent thing than it was an Asian thing. Because I would meet folks who were like, no, I also had to do that. So for me, that was the most unique thing. And turns out it wasn't that unique. So I'm excited to hear what Russell and Ian have to say.
I guess I can go. I share with Dr. Washington the experience of having grown up overseas. I was born in Hong Kong and immigrated with my family to the U.S. when I was 9. So a lot of my childhood have memories of being, bullied, which again is not specifically an Asian American thing, so much as an American thing. But the kind of questions about what did your mom pack for lunch? And you're opening up your lunchbox and people complaining about the smells of the food that you had brought to school, right? I think perhaps some of us can appreciate or be traumatized by that memory. But I think the other thing that I would say is that there are also some kind of intersectional identities that may be somewhat influenced by kind of my Asian and Asian American background. I remember coming out was particularly difficult because there was an emphasis on whether or not the family name would continue on, and whether or not that would bring shame to the family, for that kind of quote unquote dirty secret to be out. And so I think some of those experiences for LGBT people, for women, those particular challenges, those intersectional challenges, are also important to keep in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for sharing that. These aren't necessarily unique to Asians, but I think there are sort of outstanding features. And I'll just comment on two things. It is that shame-based culture actually has a strength, right? We're very aware of how we're perceived, and we're very other-centered. So what I've noticed in this Asian American movement to stop API hate, we're really concerned about building solidarity, right? Because we're concerned about how other groups relate to us. We're really concerned about visibility and our stereotypes. All the questions you asked are all representational questions. How are we being perceived? And it's not like, how are we doing? It's more about how are we being perceived, right? So even the questions that were asked today are sort of related to our shame-based orientation to being concerned about how others see us, rather than asking, how are we experiencing the racism, right? Or asking, what's grandma feel like? But the second thing I talk about is, that I think, again, is really shaping our movement is that a lot of us grow up in multi-generational households. And so I grew up with my grandmother, and I'm super connected to, whenever I see elderly, I have it touches close to home. And I think that's what's really galvanizing this movement now is we see Asian American elders being attacked, right? It's those who we honor the most being dishonored. And so this fight to stop API hate isn't for us as individuals, it's a fight for our families. And that takes a different dimension. I think that's really what's really pushing us is like, yeah, they could attack me, I could dismiss it, but don't mess with grandma, right? And so that's that multi-generational household, our closeness with our grandparents is really shaping us. So actually, I appreciate these. I think both are strengths of our community. They're not necessarily distinctives, but something we can build on to build solidarity, to build support for our elders, to support America overall in fighting for racial justice.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jeung. And I'm trying to reword this, not to say perceived, but I could not really find a substitute. So I'm going with my question. Asian Americans are generally not perceived as vocal advocates for social change. Do you see this evolving?
No, So the question is, Asian Americans are not seen, right? But again, it's a representation issue. Like Ian said, we've long fought for civil rights. We have a legacy of resistance. So whether we're seen or not, I don't care about are the perceptions. We have been longtime advocates fighting for racial justice and racial solidarity. So and I think it is changing that even now we are becoming more outspoken, more fighting for justice. 63% of Asian Americans said they were motivated by racism to vote for the first time last year in the elections. I've seen Asian Americans may not be in mainstream media, but they really use their own alternative media, their social media, YouTube, to really sound alarm to the issue. The few Asian Americans in political office, in newsrooms, in Hollywood have taken their positions of power to address anti-Asian violence. So I think especially young people are really outspoken, concerned, and it's been really heartening for me to see the Asian American community standing up to racism yet again. So not for the first time, but yet again, building on our legacy of resistance. It's been really encouraging.
Thanks, Dr. Jeung. And my next question is for Dr. Shin. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders can trace their identities to more than 50 countries. It was a surprise for me too, to first learn about it. Each of those have their own unique culture and language. Despite this, AAPI is often lumped together in data reporting and even referred to in the media. And how does this help or hinder when addressing anti-Asian racism? For Dr. Shin.
Thank you, Dr. Coppola. I wanted, before I answer your question, I want to go back to something that Dr. Jeung said, because I think one of the ways that we might move the conversation forward is to take what Dr. Jeung said and ask why, right? Why is that legacy of activism not more apparent or not more, visible in the different ways that we talk about race and the history of racism in this country? Who does it benefit when those stories are not told? And I would say, especially importantly, stories about interracial solidarity community in activism, right? So stories about the work of people like, my sort of southeastern Michigan local native, Grace Lee Boggs, or Yuri Kochiyama, who was very close with Malcolm X and was there when he was, unfortunately assassinated, but supported the Black freedom struggle. Why don't we hear about these stories, and who does it benefit, when these stories go untold? So I think that's an important question to ask as we think about a way forward out of this situation. In terms of your question about the helping or hindering, the way that we might address anti-Asian racism, when we see the kind of diversity of the community, I think one of the things that is very basic is to see how the model minority myth makes it difficult to recognize that some members of the community really do need help, right? So if we think about some of the statistics that we know of from the Pew Research Center, right, that annual median income of Indian Americans is over $100,000. But when you look at, for example, Bhutanese Americans, right, that they make only $36,000 median income. In terms of educational attainment, that Taiwanese and Indian Americans, 75%, have at least a bachelor's degree. Among Laotians, Bhutanese, Cambodians, somewhere between 11 to 17% have a bachelor's degree, right? So they're very disparate statistics within the community. And when you think about, just certain members of the community, you don't think about the support, for example, affirmative action policies that are required in order to support all members of the AAPI community. So I think it's important to think about that diversity. We've talked a little bit about ways to do that, disaggregating the data when we're counting the needs of AAPIs at institutions like the University of New Mexico, and even in government, statistic collection. That is something that we still have a long ways to go, but could do a lot to help bring others to the same level of achievements that some Asian Americans have seen and benefited from in the US.
Thank you.
So for our next question, Dr. Washington, how has social media affected movements to address anti-Asian racism? Can its utilization be improved?
So I think social media has been super important in getting the word out. I would imagine that Russell has found that StopAPI hate, right, has spread the most amongst folks who are digitally connected and using social media. I think the way that it's improved is by remembering that most people are not probably finding out about these things through social media. So I think about the work of one of my colleagues at Wisconsin, and as she writes about the Hmong community in Madison and how they still use the radio, right? So they call into one radio frequency, and that's how they get the news about their community and what's happening. And so, it's their version of social media, but outside of this sort of digital context that we understand it. And I think that that's really the thing that is the next step, is removing that from social media into real world action, into these tangible material things. And we saw that happen with the election. So, speaking of invisibility, I think looking at Georgia, obviously my own connections there, is why I was especially attuned to what was happening. But then I think about friends who were super involved in getting out this Asian American vote in Atlanta, right? And so while deservedly a lot of attention went to Stacey Abrams and other Black women who were getting out the vote in the Black community, right? What we also then didn't see is how Asians and Asian Americans were the other crucial linchpin in flipping those Senate seats and getting Georgia to turn blue. And sometimes I tell people that when I moved to Atlanta, Georgia was light blue. And so I am very excited to see it returning to what I knew. And so I think that that's what will make social media even more impactful, is to remember that where we live is not online. And so how can we now turn all the things that we learn, all the stories that we hear, into this collective action to combat the things that we're seeing and hearing online?
If I could maybe just add something to what Dr. Washington said, I think one of the things too to keep in mind is that not all social media are created equal, and there are some very dark corners of Asian American social media, where information, misinformation, anti-Black messaging, circulates frequently and virulently, and is very detrimental to the overall work of social justice. And so I think I completely agree with Dr. Washington. It's important to move these social media campaigns out into the real world. It's also important to engage, if one can, with some of the, theories and misinformation that you see on social media channels like WeChat, right, which certain members of the Asian American community use very commonly. And I've seen firsthand within my family, the kinds of, memes and viral videos that are passed back and forth, and to be able to intervene in that will be also very important. Again, because of the diversity of the community, right? Certain, especially recent Chinese immigrants, for example, are more active, for example, on WeChat versus second, third, fourth generation, Asian Americans. And so there is a little bit, I think, of a social media divide, and to find a way to kind of introduce, kind of rigorous, tested sources of information and to intervene in those conversations would be important as well.
Yeah, actually, can I jump in? Dr. Shin's right. We are so polarized by our social media bubbles, right? And so who knows what's going on in those other conversations, right? And that's why we can't talk to each other. That's why we could present data. This is how much racism's occurring. We could say, here are incidents of solidarity. Here are who the perpetrators are, but it makes no difference because they'll just say, well, that's your data. Under what authority do you have to make these claims? And so people just hear what they want to hear now. And the algorithms of our social media is that we get certain types of content that really filters out other alternative perspectives. So I know, or I'm sort of scared, like maybe my worldview is really warped by what social media and, information I get from the internet. So it's really true. And I don't know what's going on the other side, but apparently we can't talk to each other and we're not hearing each other's stories.
Thank you, Dr. Jeung. And I have a question for you. How can work on addressing anti-Asian racism fit into the larger diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racist movements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thanks. Well, first of all, I think, an injustice facing Asian Americans is an injustice facing all Americans, right? Just as we say an injustice happening to someone else is injustice to all of us. What's the Asian American community is experiencing now hurts everybody and oppresses everybody and is violence towards everybody. So if we center on the Asian American experience, we could recognize if we can improve the conditions for Asian Americans, we're improving the conditions for everybody, right? So that's my first statement in response. But I think now the way the anti-StopAPI hate movement is growing is like Dr. Shin and Dr. Washington talked about. We pay particular attentions to intersectionality and solidarity, and that's our contribution to as we fight the racism that we're experiencing. We're really concerned about who on our margins are proportionally impacted, like the elderly, right? Like women, like young people. We are more concerned about how do we build bridges. So what I see happening is that this is a great opportunity as Asian Americans go through this racial trauma and as we get healed from that racial trauma, as we deal with it, as we have been like today, then we're posed to become healers to America. Because we know what it feels like. We know what it feels like to be treated as a dangerous outsider. So we could empathize with those who are mass incarcerated. We could empathize with those who are mass detained. And as we understand this pain and as we're healed from it, then we really are in a great opportunity because we are concerned with intersectional oppression, because we are concerned about solidarity to help in the future become the healers of America. So I think if we could really address anti-Asian hate well as a community, as health sciences, as doctors, as mental health professionals help us overcome the trauma, then we're in a great position to really bridge divides that we talk about America being so polarized. We could be the bridge builders, the healers of America. So I think it's a great opportunity. It's a great privilege to be in this position. again, we're not victims, but this is our opportunity to help, again, reimagine America and claim our belongingness, and then also contribute to America.
Thank you, Dr. Jeung.
I think maybe one way to also think about how the work of addressing anti-Asian racism might fit into broader DEI and anti-racist movements is to think about this not only as fighting for Asian Americans, but against white supremacy, right? We haven't really talked about that is the fundamental issue that unites the, Stop AAPI hate, the Black Lives Matter movement, immigration reform, that these are things that are all united by the common cause of making America more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable, right? And this is something that Dr. Jeung talked about before. And one of the things I really would encourage folks to ponder as they, walk away from this conversation is that, to fight against Asian hate is not just to look out for our own community if you happen to identify as Asian or Asian American, but to look out for all communities, right? That this is a fight that we have in common with other communities because it stems from the same disease that is at the heart of American society, which is white supremacy. And so I think if we keep that in mind, then it'll be helpful to not just kind of looking out for our own interests, which often leads to the kind of anti-Blackness, right? That is also something that we see in society, but to recognize that there are allies in this fight in anti-Asian hate.
This actually transitions perfectly into our next question, which is how can Asian Americans advocate for themselves and for other people of color? How do we encourage involvement in greater social movements? And I'll invite Dr. Washington to answer first.
Yeah, so as a former Lobo, I know that I have so much fondness for the work that people do, especially in New Mexico, because I think that there's something really unique about it as a state, where this sort of triracial mythology means that the groups that fall outside of it, right, have really, really had to come together. And so, I still spend my time volunteering with the New Mexico Asian Family Center. And this year is their 15th year anniversary. And as I was reaching out to some of these other organizations around town, because we're putting together a shirt that says, here are the people who have our backs, right? And I was like, what a beautiful thing that this shirt is, because here are these organizations, right? The New Mexico Black Leadership Council, El Centro, right? Here are all of these organizations around Albuquerque who, right, might not even have Asians and Asian Americans involved, but were deeply invested in what the New Mexico Asian Family Center was doing, and then that was reciprocated. And I think that that's partially what we need to do, is that wherever it is that we find our passions, where we want to support, is where we start, right? And so knowing that that impact, chips away at things. So I think about Yazzie and Martinez, right? Even though I'm not in the College of Education, right, I'm an education professor, but I think about this equal access to education and how New Mexico leads the way in saying, hey, here are these things that are connected, right? So it's not just the brown folks in New Mexico who don't have access to great education, but also Indigenous people. So then we can extrapolate that into, well, if it's also these communities of color, I bet also the Black students, right, and the Asian students in New Mexico are similarly having difficulties. And so you start making those connections and start then building that sort of solidarity that Russell was talking about, this collective action and working together. So I think that that's how we get people involved, to start with what is most interesting, the thing that you're most invested in, and then just grow it from there, right? So yeah, and also if you want to support the New Mexico Asian Family Center, you can go to the website. We would love it. So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. I have a question for Dr. Shin. How can attendees help create change when it comes to anti-Asian racism, not only at the interpersonal level, but also at the institutional or structural level? Thank you.
I think that is such an important question, and one that we often maybe don't think about enough, because we think about anti-Asian racism as the kinds of incidents violence and interpersonal harassment that Dr. Jeung outlined at the beginning. And they are, and those are important, and they need to be addressed. But it's also important, as Dr. Coppola was alluding to think about it as a structural issue. And there are a few things that I think are important to creating change on that scale. The first would be to advocate for education about ethnic studies, about Asian American studies and Asian American history at the K-12 and collegiate level. Most people understand, if they have familiarity with Asian American history, it's because they've taken, that kind of course at the college level. But that isn't going to be enough, right? If we want to create broader change, and we are, in a very encouraging way, seeing more of that around the country. Illinois, for example, the state Senate and state House have passed legislation mandating K-12 education in Asian American history. That's now waiting for the governor's signature. Connecticut recently did the same thing. We're working on something similar in Michigan, and perhaps New Mexico could be next. I would also say, in terms of structural change, that it's important to think about anti-racism not only, again, in terms of violence, but also in terms of some of the structural conditions that locate Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, for example, in the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? So some of the issues that we might not think about as anti-Asian racism are, right? So when we're thinking about policies that create more equitable conditions, about having a living wage, about voting rights and ballot access, right? This is something that Dr. Washington was talking about earlier, about affirmative action, about anti-trafficking or pathways to citizenship. These are all policies that would be working positively towards anti-Asian racism. And then finally, I think, we've said this many times already during this webinar, but also to work to strengthen coalitions with other communities of color. That would be a really important approach to achieving some of these structural changes for benefits and advantages not only to the Asian American community, but for all people and all Americans.
Thank you, Dr. Shin.
So I'm going to invite our attendees to ask any questions. We have about 10 minutes left, and just enough time to answer a couple audience questions. If you're not comfortable unmuting or putting in the chat, you can go ahead and message me directly on the chat, or go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
If I can make a comment and pose a question. So first of all, let me say thank you so much. I've learned so much. And I think what I'm really excited about is the taping, the recording of this particular session, because as we think about enhancing our history, what's going on in our communities, this is going to add to our resources that we can provide to students and faculty and staff today, but for generations to come. So thank you so much for your wisdom and activism. As a academic center, and we always want to provide additional opportunities for our learners, can you mention any opportunities for our learners, or medical students, or public health students, or nursing students to become more engaged with your organizations and community-based organizations that serve our Asian communities in addressing hate?
Well, we at StopAPI, we take interns of all levels. We're working with high school students, undergrads and grad students. A lot of mental health research, the impact of racism on mental health and racial trauma. We have studies working on how has racism impacted healthcare professionals, right? So at StopAPI, I think we did one study, like 40% of our respondents are first responders or essential workers, right? So what are the conditions at hospitals and in healthcare places, in nursing homes and skilled home facilities, facing both professionals and service workers. So I think we welcome anybody who wants to learn with us. We're learning along the way and have lots of different types of studies. So feel free to contact us.
I think the process of learning about how to be an ally and to be, anti-racist is a lifelong process. I am still learning myself, and the last 15 months have been, a way more intense lesson than it really should have been. But some of the things that I appreciate about what's happening now is because of this increased visibility, there are more projects, more media projects that are being approved that are advancing our understanding of Asian American history and the Asian American community. So some of you may have seen, for example, the 5-hour PBS docuseries on Asian Americans that was released last year. It does a remarkable job of covering the diversity of the Asian American community that we talked about, thinking about, for example, Asian American complicity in settler colonialism in places like Hawaii, which I think would probably be a very relevant example to think about in the context of New Mexico as well. But for those of you who wish to learn more, I would certainly recommend that you watch that series. I also, as a history professor, would be remiss if I didn't recommend a history book for everybody to read. And the one that comes to mind, actually, which I'll pop in the chat, is a book that was written recently, just last year, called Herbs and Roots, about the history of Chinese herbal doctors in the United States and the roles that they played, not only as medical providers, but also as community centers, and the ways that they actually became very popular at the turn of the 20th century because of the kinds of Orientalism that especially upper middle class white women saw and associated with Chinese medicine, and the way that it changes as biomedicine comes to the fore. So that might be of interest to those of you who, again, have a clinical background or who are medical practitioners, to understand how that particular history taps into the broader history of Asians in the United States.
And I'll just, since Ian was tapping into the history, when I would teach classes at UNM, my students would be shocked all the time when I would talk about internment camps that existed in New Mexico, because they were like, oh, why would we have had those, right? And so one, that Asians are invisible to many students and to many folks already on campus, but then to learn the history of how Asians and Asian Americans have made their way through the Southwest, and especially New Mexico, I think is another way to start getting invested. There was an effort that I was a part of when I got to UNM to create an Asian American Studies program. And so that did not have a lot of buy-in from administrators, and that might be one way, even though you guys are in health sciences, to put a little bit of pressure on central admin to say, hey, we recognize that there's a need. So, we now have a Native American Studies department, hopefully soon an Africana Studies department. So what needs to join them next would be an Asian American Studies one. And I think also, putting some pressure on the governor would be great, because she often aligns the existence of Asians and Asian Americans in New Mexico, and it comes through in policy, it comes through in the way that she talks about legislation and the communities. And so that is maybe an easy way. You could just drop a little email that's like, hello, Asians and Asian Americans exist in New Mexico, so please stop ignoring these communities and start lending some actual material, tangible support to their efforts, is an easy way. Or your councilman or your representative are all, I think, really easy ways to start getting involved.
We have a little bit of a two-part question from our attendees in the chat. Some of this was already touched upon, but how should UNM go forward in creating solidarity? And how can we best hold our management accountable for these initiatives?
I mean, I like a nice tersely written email. No, I'm just kidding. I think partially is to support the students. So now there's a little grassroots student organizing around Asian Americans and creating a much more visible presence on campus. I know that there is also a pocket in the med school. And so I think joining forces with those students might be a really easy way to start doing that, because I think right now management feels like, oh, it's just students. And so we don't really have to pay attention to them. And so with your support, it will give them, I think, maybe a little bit more legibility in the eyes of administrators. And I think that's what they need.
I don't know if the chancellor or president, school president, has made any public statements denouncing the racism, but I think that's pretty effective if students, faculty could press for an official statement denouncing racism, calling for, racial unity and respect. But that's helpful because it helps Asian American students feel seen and heard, that the people on top recognize their problem. It also creates that culture of respect and dignity, right? Because we saw how much hate got normalized last year by language, by statements like Kung Flu or Chinese virus. So we need to, it seems so obvious, but recreate cultures of respect by saying, by having these official pronouncements. And then once you get the administration to make those official statements, then you could press them for more, right? And say, okay, you've made this statement, now put your money where your mouth is, and fund ethnic studies, fund mental health resources for students. And so you got to get your foot in the door by pushing for these statements that are really useful. They're not just symbolic or performative, because then you could hold them accountable to those official statements by saying, you said this, so how will you? So that's our tricky, sneaky little way that everybody knows is effective. You hold people accountable to what they say.
With that, I would like to invite any last comments from our amazing panelists.
I would just like to give special recognition, not only to our panelists for joining us today on behalf of the Health Sciences Center at the University of New Mexico, but I also want to give a special shout out to APAMSA, the Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association. They have done phenomenal work bringing together students, allopathic and osteopathic medical students, staff, and faculty for decades now. And especially in the past year, they've put out a lot of great toolkits. They're the next generation, right? They're our future faculty, our future administrative leaders. So I just want to give a shout out to APAMSA.
I want to just add one parting thought, which is that I don't think, when activists and scholars reflect on the course of Asian American activism, for the last few decades, not since the Vincent Shin killing in 1982, has there been this groundswell of visibility and energy. And it's so important that we seize on this now, while there is attention on the issue, on the needs of the community, and there is all of this kind of understanding about the need for solidarity and intersectionality, to seize on that momentum and to build towards positive change. So I hope that will happen, at UNM. I hope that it'll happen in health sciences and across the entire university, even as it happens across the rest of the country as well.
Yeah, I'd like to thank University of New Mexico, especially Dr. Pang, for organizing this, for Dr. Kalpila for helping moderate. I think my closing statement is, we talked about how this experience has been really traumatizing for the broader Asian American community. And as health science people, as healthcare professionals, as doctors, you have a real significant role of helping us overcome this community trauma and to help us deal with it. So we know from trauma-informed care that the presence of caring individuals is really significant, and coming together to gain support for one another helps us deal with the trauma. So keep on being the doctors and healthcare professionals that you are, and journeying with us as we deal with the trauma. Thank you very much.
I mean, those two things were wonderful, so I have nothing else to add other than thanks for having me. And it was so good to kind of be back in the land of enchantment virtually. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jeung, Dr. Shin, and Dr. Washington for sharing your insights. This has been very helpful.
Thank you again. I am so happy that we were able to host this plan. I'm so happy that all of you were able to join us for this topic that's also near and dear to my heart. And I would like to thank Dr. Sanchez and the Office of DEI for being able to have this platform for us to have this discussion and have this panel. So thank you so much for everyone for attending. If you miss any of the panel, the recording will be online, and I'll be sharing with all the panelists as well. So thank you again, and with that, we'll close.
Thank you, everyone.